Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. First of all, we're going to start with a little bit of housekeeping of how we're going to run the day before we introduce all the panelists today. So can I kindly ask somebody from the audience or a couple of you to raise your hand so that we can actually check that we hear each other? We're not just heads talking at you. We're good. Excellent. Thank you. The panel today that we're very happy joined us. We'll discuss some of the key questions around UK-EU relationship, and then of course, we'd like to make this as interactive as possible. We shall not keep each other for more than an hour. Therefore, I really suggest we get through some of the key issues with our excellent panelists that we have here today. Joining us digitally is Professor Anand Menon. He's a director of UK in Changing Europe and Professor of European Politics and Foreign Affairs at King's College London. Welcome, Anand. We're very happy that you were able to take the time. Also with us digitally, we have His Excellency Tadej Rupel. He's the ambassador of Slovenia to the UK, very well informed, and he has been in the position for a number of years. We are hosted by Her Excellency Sophie, the British ambassador to Slovenia, and we're very happy that we can sit here together at the residence. Also with us today is Ula Hudina, the Deputy Head of European Commission representation in Slovenia. And sitting on the sofa, last but not least, Professor Matej Avbelj, Professor of European Law at New University at Faculty of Government and European Studies. So let's get a head start. It's great to be at the residence, and CIP and the British Embassy have partnered on this, and we wanted the opportunity to reflect on where the UK-EU relationship is today and where is it going. We've had a bit of a quietening down in the coverage of this because of the COVID and coronavirus hitting us in Europe very badly, but doesn't mean it's not happening. The UK has essentially already left the EU, and the end of the transition year is this year. So what happens next? Will there be a trade deal? It seems pretty clear that both sides aren't going to budge on their red lines. And what happens to the UK afterwards? Does the UK public really still want this? We will consult this with Anand particularly. And why was there a majority vote to leave in the first place? So I would like to start with Anand with a question of what is facing the UK in the next 12 to 24 months? What are the best and worst scenarios that you believe will be facing the UK in the next year or two in the future relationship with the EU, and how has coronavirus affected this or will affect it in the future?
That's quite an agenda for 5 minutes, but I'll do my very best to try and cover as much of that as possible. I mean, the first point I think to make about Brexit and where we are in the UK is that Brexit is an intensely and primarily political undertaking. We have a government that takes very seriously the mantra of the Leave campaign, which was the mantra of taking back control. And it is from that come the red lines that the government has laid down. As David Frost, who is Boris Johnson's main advisor in these talks, pointed out in a lecture in Brussels earlier this year, taking back control of our laws isn't negotiable because as far as the government is concerned, it is the whole point of doing Brexit in the first place. And so things like, for instance, the decision not to extend the transition period, because it was an intensely political pledge, is simply a pledge on which the government is not willing to go back. So I suppose the first lesson is to take what the government says seriously, because even if what the government says implies significant economic costs for the United Kingdom, and leaving the European Union does involve significant economic costs for the United Kingdom, this is not something that is being driven by economics. It's being driven above all else by the politics. And the politics dictates that the Prime Minister doesn't extend transition, ends it at the end of the year, and does so with or without a deal, though he has a very clear preference for getting a deal. To get a deal, I should say, he and the European Union are going to have to compromise a little bit on their red lines. As things stand, when it comes to things like level playing field, when it comes to fisheries, when it comes to the structure of any agreement with the European Union, the red lines of the two sides are incompatible. So there has to be some movement. It's also worth saying that there will be economic costs for the United Kingdom whether we get a deal or not, because the kind of deal that is negotiable between now and the end of this year will be far from the kind of comprehensive accord that both sides in the past have said they wanted. Of course, COVID intrudes on this process and intrudes in several ways. It intrudes in a very practical way, in the sense that both Michel Barnier and David Frost came down with the virus, which has slowed down the negotiations. It also intrudes on the political calculation in several ways. Firstly, an assumption on the part of some in government that COVID represents a pretty handy way of covering up any economic impacts of Brexit. That is to say, the scale of the post-lockdown recession will be such that any short-term impact of Brexit will effectively be lost in the noise. I'm not convinced this is true, partly because Brexit will impact on the British economy very differently to COVID. So one of the great success stories of our economy during the pandemic has been the way food supply chains have kept working as they did before. Once you've got through the hassle of queuing to get inside the supermarket, everything you want to buy is still there and the prices are still the same. There is a danger that under Brexit that changes, because of course Brexit implies the need for checks at borders and might imply tariffs on agricultural products that will change prices. So I think the Brexit impact will be differentiable from the COVID impact. The fundamental point for me of where we are now is that even though the kind of deal that will be agreed is a pretty thin one, there is a significant difference between getting a deal and not getting a deal. I think in the event that the UK leaves without a deal, the danger is that you will have a significant and rapid deterioration of political relations. It's easy to imagine, for instance, if the talks break up in the autumn, that we enter a process of mutual recrimination and finger pointing. We'll blame the Europeans, particularly those member states worst hit by the economic fallout of no deal, like the French, will point the finger at us. And it will be very, very hard at that point for the two sides to sit down again and keep talking. And the one thing that is clear from the negotiations now is that even if we get a deal, the two sides will have to keep talking for many years to come. I fear that one of the implications of Brexit is we spend forever in a period of constant negotiation with the European Union, much as the Swiss do. And because the deal we're going to get is so thin, there will be all sorts of issues: foreign policy, counter-terrorism cooperation, the list goes on, where we will need to keep negotiating with the European Union to come to a solution. So my takeaway from this is whatever deal we end up signing, and I do hope we sign a deal, it will be far better to do so than not, because ultimately we're neighbours, we're partners, we're trading partners, and we need to find a way to keep collaborating, and that will require a series of ongoing negotiations, hopefully to take us beyond wherever we arrive by the end of this year in the formal Brexit negotiations. I think that's 5 minutes.
Thank you. Anand, thank you so much for this opening. You've laid out quite a number of topics. Meanwhile, I'm sure as you're listening in the audience that you have many questions that are coming up for you as well. So please submit them into the chat so that we can come up, come up in the discussion and we can answer your questions. I would like to turn to His Excellency Tadej Rupel. He's also been in London for a number of years. Would you agree with Anand's prognosis? And what matters most to Slovenia with the UK-EU relationship?
So welcome all, and thank you for having me today. So tomorrow is going to be 4 years since the Brexit referendum took place. So it's been a long ride where we are today, and we are currently in a very important moment in the process of negotiating the framework of our future relationship between UK and EU. Talking about Brexit, of course, there is no win-win situation. So we have to limit the damage and maximize the potential, and we have to balance the cost. So finding the agreement now is of crucial importance. And we are now maybe slightly more optimistic about the agreement than we were for the last 4 months. Time which we are living in is also affected by COVID. And I can agree with Anand that Brexit can be differentiated by the COVID, although there are some negative impact, economic fallout will be blurred at the stage after UK finally end the transition period. So I'm very happy that chief negotiators on both sides agree on an ambitious agenda in next months. We have actually 4 months which are ahead of us. We need to take into account that the deal has to be agreed by the end of October to leave some specific time for the ratifications in the European Parliament or national parliaments. So we are actually facing the technical complexity of de-entangling what was built in the half a century and its unprecedented situation. I have to tell also that we sense it as a very, very politically sensitive process with different level of engagements, and UK government rapidly stated that no extension, especially as part of the Conservative manifesto, that in 6 months UK will be leaving single market and customs union. It's obvious that everybody prefers a deal. Citizens and businesses and all the rest, we have to adapt to a new situation. I'm sure that the deal will give some kind of predictability, and rights of the citizens are really high on our priority list. It's a very compassionate note on that. I can agree with Anand that if you get a deal, the trade negotiations will take time. If we look around, EU negotiated deals for 10 plus years with some other economic powers around the world. So we are probably expecting that. And it also very hard to get such a full and high alignment of a deal we are enjoying now as UK was a member. It still is in the transition period. About the future relations, next few years, I think that as a European citizen, I'm quite optimistic that because we share strategic interests and fundamental rights and values, that we will strike a deal, and that I think that's important to cooperate on all the fields, also on security and defense. We hope that UK will come towards us with our proposal we put forward in this area. We share the global aspects. We should act as a Europe, not as a UK and EU. And we are all aware that there are big challenges ahead of us. And I think that we are in the midst of the global pandemic now, and global recession is on the horizon if it's not already here. So both economies, UK and EU economies, we are not in a very positive and comfortable situation, so we have to look forward in this regard. Let me just conclude on the Slovenian positions. Of course, as I mentioned, citizens' rights are very important, and then we are also very strong supporter to finding the agreement that will be of interest of both sides. So we would also like to be certain that there is institutional framework in the area of the common foreign and security policy, CFSP. I think also agree that there is a great potential to develop new policies like green growth, sustainable development, as well as to have UK still very on the top as a UK role in the field of development aid. We just realized the development aid was merged within the FCO now, so it's a new way, but still I think we need to also maybe look into the future and use this pandemic, which has caused a lot of damage on social, economic side, that we can use it for to build greener economy and improve the transport, etc. So thank you so much for this.
Thank you, Tadej. And at this point, I would like to turn to Ula. What does the Commission representation think about the change of pace of negotiations? It was now very clearly stated that we are not going to have an extension, and so everything needs to be done in a very short period of time. And what's your position on this?
Meaning the Commission representation position in Slovenia is aligned with the chief negotiator's position, meaning with the European Commission negotiating in this process. And as it was stated in the beginning, indeed, the COVID process had an impact on the process itself. Basically, immediately when both chief negotiators got better, then the process was restarted. And it was also the COVID way, meaning there was lots of video conferences, which is basically what we are having now. So this is, in a way, a new way of negotiating. But basically, I can say that now a new momentum is required. And that was also felt last week. June has been filled with meetings, high-level meetings in this respect, and especially last week was full of them. There was on the 12th of June, there was the second meeting of the Joint Committee. Then on the 15th of June, the President of the Commission, President of the Parliament, President of the Council, they met with the UK Prime Minister, and they took note of the UK decision not to extend the transition period. And then this was also discussed at last week at the Council. And as it was flagged also by a professor, that time is really short. We are less than 5 months away, but plus we need to take into account that there is ratification time needed. So this is why I think it's what was felt last week is that the new momentum is required, and there was the willingness on both sides that everyone needs to undertake all possible ways and efforts to negotiate and to now over the summer to intensify the talks. I think that's in mutual interest. But of course, in parallel, what is needed on both sides is that there is a proper implementation of the withdrawal agreement, because this has been basically the basis to build on the mutual trust. And it's a document that it's a legally binding document for both sides. So it's in principle 2 parallel processes. And there are topics that are known that will be discussed, especially now over the summer. Some topics that already Professor touched upon, that's the level playing field, the governance, and of extreme importance for both sides, of course, the citizens' rights. So we can see from the Commission perspective that the common interest in reaching this agreement will be intensified over the summer months. So I can assume that July and August will be very much full. I would also assume full of video conferences to continue this process. So that would be in short that, yeah, there is willingness on both sides to continue, but time is definitely very short.
That is true, and a lot of things are going to change. And Matej, what do you believe is likely to change because of UK's exit from the EU? And now we're on a very short timeline, so maybe that pushes us to actually take action and prioritize this.
Thank you, Katja, for your questions. Thank you very much for inviting me here. Really, in a way, it's important to remind us what a major blow the British referendum was 4 years ago. It's been now, as we speak, somehow overshadowed by another blow, which is called the Corona crisis. But it's always been so, because European integration has been always a process, has been so much event-driven, and we are just focusing on specific events as they come across. But I'm sure that a lot will change, and I'd just like to pinpoint to 3 major points, painting somehow the bigger picture that might be changing in the future. And in order to understand these points, we have to understand what the UK represented, what kind of voice the UK was in the European Union. It wasn't just a major voice, it wasn't just one of the most important member states, but it was also in political terms a voice that was anti-federal, if I may say so. It was a voice that was fundamentally economically liberal. It was for a competitive European Union. It was for a strong and robust single market with a lot of competition. And because of that, the UK's position was always much more conservative in terms of social Europe. And by way of this exit, I think there will be much more room for a federal Europe. There will be less room for a liberal economic Europe, and there will be more room for social Europe. What I also think the Brexit situation proves is that the current state, and already the state at which the European Union was at the stage of Brexit, demonstrated that the present situation in the EU is unsustainable. So that this invites for a major change in the European Union. And I also think that there has been much reflection on it already. And now we have to move beyond doing just the talk. We have to do the walk. So I put a lot of emphasis on the conference on the future of the European Union. I think major issues should be addressed there. And there will be a lot of opportunity for the European Union to realize that it must become stronger, that it must become more united, and it must invest also more into its own foreign security policy, also in its own diplomatic force. By British exit, the European Union will lose a lot on that front. So there will be a major investment will need to be put into that direction. So we are just pointing out these 3 points: more federal Europe, probably it will be less economically liberal Europe, but maybe for that matter, more social Europe will have in place. Thank you.
Very interesting. Sophie, I do want to stick a little bit to the point of the current timeline and how close we are to the end of the year, even though it may not look like it right now. But and it's the entire process is looking very complicated to manage. Whilst we're still in the middle of overcoming COVID, and at the end of the day, we have to get this ratified as well in all the European parliaments. Is this actually doable?
Thank you, Katja. And absolutely, it is. I think building on what Ulla was saying, it was very clear at the meeting last week between Boris Johnson as UK Prime Minister and Mrs. von der Leyen, Mr. Sassoli, Mr. Michel as the leaders of the 3 European institutions, that everyone wanted to put momentum and energy into making progress. And as many colleagues have said, that's because everyone agrees that it would be better to reach a deal. And so they agreed to have intensified talks through the course of July, face-to-face wherever that's possible within public health guidelines, to try and make progress. And yes, of course, it's complicated and tricky, but I absolutely think it is possible. Yes, the UK is looking for a very different relationship with the EU. We are no longer members of the EU. We'll be coming out of the single market and customs union, but we are looking for a strong and friendly relationship. And something that's not novel or unprecedented. Actually, we are looking for a free trade agreement based on precedent, as the EU has with many other partners, and arrangements in other areas also based on precedent. So with will, absolutely, we think it's possible to get there. But from our side, some principles are really important. And as Anand was explaining, these are really points that came out of the referendum and are therefore a very fundamental part of the government's mandate. And that is that we have left the EU. So of course, we can't be bound by jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. That doesn't make sense because we're no longer part of the EU. That would be completely unprecedented. So we do need to respect those principles, but absolutely we think it's possible to make progress. And you know, as you were saying, Matej, there are so many shared interests in many areas. Of course, we want to continue working together on foreign policy and security, but we don't think that needs a complicated, overarching governance framework. We already work together in many areas. And so I guess in sum, I would agree with Ulla that I think there is new momentum and that absolutely we think it's possible to make progress, but on both sides, we really have to understand each other's red lines and then try to do that. And then Matej, you and also Tadej talked about you know, lose-lose here. But one thing I would say is that there is a really important point about democratic accountability. And sometimes I think people forget that looking at this whole question. You know, this was the referendum we had. In Slovenia, you have referenda quite often, right? In the UK, we don't so often. And this was a huge democratic exercise which put to the public test an issue that has been so much debated. And yes, the result was very close, but nevertheless, it was a clear result. The current government came in on a very clear mandate to deliver that result. So that's what we're working to do. And I think there is a beneficiary in terms of democratic accountability, because fundamentally the EU is a union of sovereign member states who are all tied back to democratic accountability. So I do think that that is a positive.
We can vote now on the questions. Okay. Wonderful. We have some questions coming in. Sorry, we're just coordinating so that we can get the right questions posed. Also, we were able to upload the some questions onto the chat, and we would like all the participants to vote on them if these are any of the questions that they would like to get answered. So let's go to Tobias now. Who had a question, what will be the UK's, actually a number of questions, Tobias, thank you. What will be the UK's strategic and operational contributions to EU external relations in the Eastern neighbourhood, Balkans, Mediterranean, and so forward? How will the UK government express the declared Europeanness of Britain in the framework of other international organizations such as the Council of Europe, the OSCE, and the UN? And why have the UK government members contemplated leaving the European Convention on Human Rights? So quite a handful. Perhaps, shall we start with Anand?
Okay, the European Convention on Human Rights, there had been a long-standing desire on the parts of some people in the Conservative Party for us to leave it, because for those people it's seen as something that basically allows people we don't want to stay in the country to be able to stay. It protects people we wouldn't choose to protect under our own law. They're a vocal minority in the governing party, and I think, as has been the way with our politics for quite a while now, every now and again the leadership throws them some red meat by making a comment that hints at a desire to leave the ECHR. I don't think it's going to happen in this parliament, not least because there's so much else that this parliament needs to do that I don't think it'll be a priority. On foreign policy cooperation, one of the saddest things about the way these talks are proceeding is that the British government at the moment isn't even negotiating on foreign policy cooperation. In fact, if you look at the Conservative manifesto from last election in December, it didn't mention foreign and security policy cooperation with the European Union at all. And I think the simple fact is, because of where politics is at the moment, in the short term, it's going to be very, very hard for this government to work constructively with the Europeans, particularly within the framework of EU approaches to foreign policy. I suppose the hope is that as this becomes slightly less visceral politically, the UK-EU relationship, the two sides will be able to come to some pragmatic agreements as to how to collaborate better. But I'd emphasize there that both sides need to be pragmatic. I think on both sides at the moment, there is a slight digging in of the heels. So I think the EU's attitude towards UK participation in Galileo, where at one point the UK was described as a potential security threat, was unhelpful and wasn't the way to arrive at the kind of close interrelationship that I think both sides would benefit from.
Any other panelists that would like to react to the question that there was also a number of, yeah.
Thanks, Katja. Yeah, it's a natural one for me as well. And I think, of course, the UK wants to continue working with the EU on the shared threats and interests that we face across the spectrum of foreign policy. But when it comes to the negotiations, our perspective is that we don't need a heavy institutional framework to enable that. I mean, actually, the way that the UK currently works with the EU in different arenas of foreign policy depends on the issue. So, for instance, there's clear arrangements on Iran, different on Libya. We're also working closely on climate change. Given where I sit as UK ambassador in Slovenia, I probably know most about the cooperation that we have on the Western Balkans, where we talk very much and bilaterally also with countries like Slovenia, which sits just above the Balkans and as a former part of former Yugoslavia really understands the region well. We have a lot of detailed cooperation, discussion to really understand what's happening, because what happens in the Western Balkans is really important for prosperity and security in this part of Europe, but it's also really important for UK prosperity and security. So I think that all that will continue. And for the moment, we're not looking for an institutional framework, but that doesn't mean that cooperation and dialogue is not going to happen in this arena. Absolutely, I think it will.
Matej, I just wanted to draw to you on there's been a lot of, I see some comments and questions on the security as well. What happens after the UK leaves? I mean, the UK is one of the biggest contributors to, in security terms, to European security as such as well. And is Europe as EU going to have to get its act together, or are we going to see continuation of this defense cooperation? What do you think?
I think it will be both. I think this will be, as I indicated before, this will be sort of an impetus for the European Union to investing more in its own defense cooperation, in its own foreign security policy. But at the same time, I believe we still have to be wedded to the idea of the multilateralism in international relations, and we have to draw on the existing relationships, right? NATO, bilateral relationships. And I think because this has really been sort of the landmark of the West investing into multilateral relationships, and making not just ourselves stronger and safer and more secure, but also the world as such. And I think here, of course, the European Union and the UK will really need to cooperate closely.
Tadej, would you like to comment on this point as well?
Yes, thank you. As I mentioned, I think that we need to negotiate somehow the framework, future cooperation on the common security and foreign and security policy. It's our belief that we need to understand that the format which is usually mentioned nowadays, the E3, so that UK, France, and Germany would deal in terms of the foreign and security policy issues is I think the framework is much bigger. There are 27 member states, not just 2 in EU, and that we think that it's not sustainable, and all the topics which will be discussed on the E3 format has to be probably discussed later on in the full format of EU 27. So I think that there should be some kind of reach out to our proposal, which was put forward on a table from EU side in the term of the negotiations, which UK didn't open it yet. I would just like to comment about the support for the democratic accountability and public test. I fully agree. Of course, Slovenia and many other EU countries had more referendums than UK. And my question was first, of course, why such a question was put forward in terms of not so good record of experience in referendums, but this is the discussion which was already passed forward. But I was talking about the consequences of the referendum and, of course, the consequences of the Brexit, which will be probably not positive, let's say so. Thank you.
Thank you. I will go back straight to the questions, and we may be jumping around the topics, but I think it's very important that we address your questions. This is what we're holding this discussion. So when you said that the EU has trade agreements with other partners, to which model do you refer as being the most appropriate one for the UK? And I think it's great to get both the perspective, perhaps from Ula, as well as from the UK, from Anand, and perhaps Sophie. Ula, would you like to tackle this one?
Yes, meaning we don't have a recipe which one is the best one. This is basically now being negotiated. But a fact is that the UK withdraw from the common market. So whatever type of the free trade agreement would be negotiated, and of course it will take time. But as of as of end of the transition period, the UK is and will be treated as a third country. So the agreement now, whatever form, it's part of the negotiation. So I cannot really say which one to pick. But of course, the status will change. And what is of utmost importance, not just for the businesses and trade, it's the predictability. And this is what is needed on both sides. So I think this will be the rule in negotiating, the predictability. And of course, both markets are, irrespective of the trade agreement that would be reached, will remain very important for each other as trading partners. So this is also another rule that they will have both sides, both negotiators in mind. But yeah, transition period is short, and to agree on proper trade agreement, free trade agreement that probably these two partners would like to have as very natural trading partners will be difficult to reach, yeah. But I don't have the recipe, of course.
Anand, would you care to give your take?
Yeah, I'd say a couple of, firstly, just to play devil's advocate, what I would say is the European Commission is very quick to say we're a third country like any other, unless it's fish, where they want exactly the same access as they enjoyed when we were a member state. So I think both sides claim to be acting in the name of principle. And on the British side, the slight dishonesty, I think, is the government insists that we want a deal like Canada has with the European Union. And actually what they're asking for is something significantly beyond what Canada has. And the reason for that is simple, it's geography. So Canada, for instance, doesn't, surprisingly enough, have massive issues with the European Union when it comes to road haulage, because there aren't that many trucks that go from Canada to the European Union. We have enormous issues when it comes to road haulage for obvious reasons. And so we want a special deal on that Canada doesn't have. We want mutual recognition of qualifications, which Canada doesn't really have. So we're asking for something that is, you know, we're calling it Canada, but actually the reality of geography and history means that we need something that's significantly more developed than Canada. So like with all deals, this will be unique to the person asking. And I think, you know, it would be weird if the UK-EU relationship looked like the relationship with Japan or with Canada or with Ukraine, because we're not Japan or Canada or Ukraine. There are specific elements. Can I just ask one very quick question to finish, which is, I started answering some of these questions by typing answers and I wasn't sure whether I was allowed to or whether you didn't want me to.
Yeah, you got a thumbs up. So.
Oh, okay, all right.
I just hope that if you already answered it and I cannot see it, then we're not doing it twice. But Sophie, I wanted to give you a word before we move on to the next question.
Thanks, Katya. And I don't have a computer here, so we'll come in person. But on the point about FTAs, I think the point is that we are looking for an FTA, as the EU has with other friendly partners like Canada, Japan, Mexico. That doesn't mean that it's going to be identical. Of course, as Anand said, there will be differences, but the point is that it's possible to agree one in a way that doesn't cut across some of the fundamental principles emerging from the referendum. So, for instance, that the UK can't be bound by ECJ jurisdiction. ECJ doesn't have a role in other FTAs. So that's the fundamental point. And I think in citing those other examples, we are arguing that we think that we absolutely think this is possible. And given that we will be a third country and we do want to maintain and build trade flows, but we're coming out of the single market and customs union, then this is the natural thing to look at. This is the right area for us to focus on.
From the EU side, Matej, do you have anything to add from the European perspective, how the trade deal should look like, or any?
You know, a free trade agreement is a free trade agreement. There's a lot of economic theory behind it. So it's not a novel idea. I would agree here with Anand. It will be a sui generis something, depending on political pragmatism in place, compromises, and of course, following the underlying principles, those stipulated by the referendum rationale in the UK and those stemming from the whole body of law of the European Union. So really the negotiating skills will demonstrate to us what's actually possible. And I also think it won't be set in stone for good. It might change in the future.
Thank you. We have another question about studying in the UK.
If Katja, can I just add something here that basically the basis for negotiating here, everything, if I was not perhaps so clear in the second answer, but I was clear in the first answer, is basically the withdrawal agreement, everything that both sides already committed to. And in that withdrawal agreement is also now the sticky point, which is the fisheries. And there is not going now, at least from the Commission side, not going beyond what was already agreed in the withdrawal agreement. And this is now also the part of the negotiations, of course. So it's not really now the cherry picking, but sticking to the withdrawal agreement, which, as I said in the first answer, is legally binding for both sides. I just wanted to add this before we move on. Thanks.
Sure, thank you. I would like to move on with the other question that came in, and that's studying in the UK. Some concerned student or potentially future student, and how hard is it going to be for international students to now study in the UK? Are there going to be more barriers for EU students that want to enter and study in the UK?
Thanks, Katya. I think that's a natural one for me, and it'd be great if Anand comes in as well as professor at King's in London. But I think UK universities have benefited for a long time from having an influx of excellent, highly qualified EU students. And of course, we want that to continue, and they will continue to be very welcome. One of the strengths of UK higher education is that we have so many highly qualified international students. For the next academic year, so for 2021, tuition fees will remain the same as they have been whilst the UK has been a member of the EU, so EU students will still have home fee status. Fees after that are still to be determined. But I think the principle is that, yes, of course, we will still want and still try and make it easy for EU students to come and study in the UK, because that's of huge benefit to us. But it'd be good to hear Anand's perspective, particularly from King's.
I mean, you're absolutely right on fees. We don't know what happens to EU students and fees going forward, and that's a big uncertainty. I'd be very, very surprised if the government, via visas or something, made it harder for students to come to the UK, not least because universities are going to be in desperate financial circumstances following COVID. I mean, the higher education sector is getting very, very badly hit. There's been a big decrease in the numbers of people applying. Some of the top universities are very, very dependent, for instance, on Chinese students, and there's no sign of Chinese students wanting to come to the United Kingdom to study at the moment. And so I suspect going forward, it'll be in the interests of universities and the government, because of course, universities are a massive export sector for us, to facilitate foreign students coming as far as possible.
I'll just come back in really quickly on this, because the last couple of years here in Ljubljana, we've done a study in the UK event, basically an information event for Slovene students who are considering studying in the UK, to encourage you to still consider the UK as an excellent destination for higher education. So we'll probably be doing something like that again this autumn, so that we can give as much clarity as possible. And it's normally a really fun thing, because we also invite Slovene alumni who've studied in the UK at different universities and try and match people with the topics and the institutions that they're interested in, so they can hear from Slovenes who've studied there in the past.
Meanwhile, thank you. I had one more question just for Anand, and if you already tackled it, then let me know. Do you think that Labour government would handle the pandemic differently, and how so?
I did write back to that one.
Oh, you did?
Yes. I hope they got the answer. If they didn't, they should just say they didn't get the answer, and I can.
No, I'm probably the one that's out there.
Right. Okay.
That's all right. Then in that case, I guess we should move on. I just had another question being placed here. Would you agree that COVID-19 could make the position of some EU member states harder? For example, that there would be more perspective in some areas for the for the UK to align to the EU mandate. Am I understanding this correctly? Am I reading this? Yeah. Like, as in, if the health crisis, it had hit the French auto industry very hard. I'm not sure if I got the end of that right. Would that be? Okay, sorry. People feeding me comments. Was that understandable to the panelists? Yeah. Okay. Who would like to take the first go, Matej?
But I just pick up on the point I already made. It's a question of less economic liberalism, more protectionism. And I think what we've seen, over the, not centuries, but over decades, as the West was hit by different crises, that the states some sort of resorted behind their own borders. There was more protectionism. So there might be this kind of impulse in this case as well. But how exactly we will see when we sit at the table. I would, as a personal, as an academic, I would argue as much as possible in favor of free trade, as little as possible protectionism, because in the longer run, the protectionism destroys economy, and in the longer run, it makes us all poorer.
I would actually go to Tadej if he has anything to add to this question. Is the position of EU member states harder due to COVID?
Sorry, I didn't get the question. So if the Slovenian positions or EU positions or UK positions were stronger?
EU member states. So the question was, would you agree that COVID-19, so the corona crisis, could make the position of some EU member states harder in perspective?
Yeah, I think that we are all aware that COVID didn't help much in terms of the Brexit negotiations. It's an obstacle which we have to overcome together. We are lagging behind here in UK with the pandemic, as the rest of the European Union, or at least majority of the European Union countries. And I'm quite sure that the focus of the negotiation talks in UK are not the prime concern. So I think that countries, European Union countries, are well aware that we need to have something done by the end of the year. As I mentioned, we have 4 active months ahead of us. There are also some holidays and some summertime and ratification process at the end. So I think that the positions were not changed. I think that we are very clear. We want somehow a more ambitious agreement, not something from top of the shelf, as it was mentioned. So something more comprehensive, as we were already counting on the political declaration which was done and signed by the current prime minister at the time when withdrawal agreement was signed. We are now in the phase of implementing withdrawal agreement, and the other side, as I said, we would like to have more comprehensive approach, not I don't want to use the cherry picking approach, but it is approach which shows more skeleton, not comprehensive agreement. And I think that we are standing firm behind our negotiator, Barnier, chief negotiator, and I think that we are quite strong, and the divisions are not visible as some might indicate to that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Sophie, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, briefly. Thank you, Katja. I think perhaps to pick up a point that Tadej was making, and also Ulla previously, I just want to be clear that we are really firmly committed to the withdrawal agreement, and also to the political declaration, which sets out the principles for this new agreement that we are striving for together. On the impact of COVID, what I've seen is that on the one hand, of course, in practical terms, it affected how we needed to negotiate. And I think Ulla described this really well. The negotiations have gone on in a different way with more video link, but they have gone on. And at the same time, what I found here in real life, when we were confronted with the pandemic and all sorts of challenges, including citizens being stranded in each other's countries, shortages of protective equipment, economic challenges, I found that in real life, from day to day, there has been huge and fantastic cooperation. And I hope, and I think that that's also a lesson for how we can continue to work together, because at the end of the day, it's in the interest of the UK and the EU to find ways. And COVID was an example when we were faced with a real life big challenge to all of us. And did we retreat from each other, or did we cooperate? No, we cooperated. And I think that's a good lesson for the future.
I would like to move on to the next question, which is, how much freedom does Slovenia have to define its relationship with the UK? I believe that would go to our Slovenian colleagues particularly. I'm looking at Tadej mostly, but
Yeah.
Tadej, would you like to take this?
As you know, the functioning of the European Union is well defined with all the treaties, and of course, a majority of the common policies like common defense policy, common security, foreign, as well as other topics are not entirely up to specific state to define. But there are, of course, many areas where we can extend our own cooperation in terms of the culture, in terms of the education, where we can have some kind of a stronger links. Then I have to mention that as an embassy here in UK, we are putting strong emphasis on the people-to-people connections, on the twinning programs, on the exchange of in different varieties, on the business cooperation. Of course, this is always a strong input of every country through the economic diplomacy. So there are many areas. Of course, we are moving in terms of the agreements we will be signing, or we will have a agreement in different fields. But nevertheless, I think that we are stronger together as a European Union, and we are always trying to make this condition that majority of the policies we are leading are in terms of making us stronger and better positioned towards the other parties, whether is this will be UK or any other global players around the world.
Matej, would you like to add?
Oh, it's a tricky question.
It is a tricky question.
Academics like tricky questions, but this time around, I won't toy with it that much. I mean, there are two levels, right? I think on the relationship between the UK and the EU, I mean, it's important for the EU really to stand as one in terms of the success of the negotiations in fulfilling the interests of the European Union. But then Slovenia has all the freedom, but not just all the freedom, but also all the responsibility to make its own points clear to the European Commission and to the inside the European Council to foster those specific interests that are in Slovenia's interest. And as the ambassador has pointed out, I think here Slovenia has so far done a relatively good job.
Okay, fair enough. Sophie, would you like to add, knowing both sides?
Sure. No, I would say that together we do have the freedom to shape our bilateral relationship. Obviously, that has to be founded on based on the foundation of the relationship between the UK and the EU, but consistent with that foundation, it is for us to shape the areas that we want to work on most together. And that's something that I've loved doing over the last 5 years with Tadej, with colleagues here in Ljubljana. And what have we chosen to focus on? We've chosen to support businesses who are looking to work together even more closely. We have worked closely on security, had dialogue around issues like the Western Balkans, which is a real interest for both the UK and Slovenia. As Tadej was saying, working on education, seeing where we can learn from each other, and about people-to-people links, looking at the historic links, and also how we can keep building those today. So I think that together we do have the freedom to shape our bilateral links, but obviously only in a way that's consistent with the underpinning relationship between the UK and the EU.
Mm-hmm. And Ula, if I were to ask you the question, how much freedom Slovenia has?
Perhaps I would like to refer here to Sophie's comment before that now during COVID-19, there was so much basically solidarity shown on all sides, even passengers traveling from one country to another, etc. But of course, until the end of this year, the UK is still in transition period. The UK is still treated as a member state, and this was also reflected in all this excellent cooperation and solidarity shown. But of course, the clock is ticking now for what happens after the transition period. Chief Negotiator Barnier, he has all the support, as other counterparts said, all the support from the member states. And the mandates that the member states are giving him to the Commission as negotiating on behalf of the EU is indeed discussed at the Council. And yes, Slovenia can say, but it has to be as a package. It has to be a mandate that the Commission has been given already since 2017. So yes, some freedom, but within the mandate given to the chief negotiator, if this is correctly and enough in diplomatic words. But yeah, as it was last week felt, also there is strong support of the European Parliament in going ahead with the mandate that Chief Negotiator Barnier has. So he felt it, and this was also stressed by the Commission President then at the European Council on Friday, when basically she briefed of the meeting that she had 2 days ago together with the Parliament President Sassoli and with the Council President Michel. So yes, some freedom, but it has to be agreed together with other member states.
Thank you. Sophie, we have another question for you. Why didn't the UK extend the transition period after the COVID-19 pandemic? We're saying after, but hopefully we don't have a second wave. Anand said apparently the Q&A that Boris Johnson, that it's politics, that Boris Johnson said that he would not. What's your take?
I think it's my version of that, which is that the government came in December on a very clear mandate to deliver on the referendum, to leave the EU and to stick to the current timetable. And I think, also in the past, people have found that when the timetables are extended, what happens is the negotiations just get stretched out. And yes, these are difficult issues, but sometimes you do have to have a firm deadline in order to make progress. And we absolutely think that we can now, and we need to, because as Tadej also said, tomorrow will be 4 years since the referendum. So that's quite some time, and it's really time to forge and move on to that new relationship.
Anand, is there anything you'd like to add on this?
No, I just think that the unique selling point of this Prime Minister is the politician who delivers on what he said about Brexit. And that's one of the reasons why he was popular, one of the reasons why he won the election. And I think he's loath to lose that reputation. There's also the fact, of course, that in Parliament, there are quite a number of Conservative MPs who would react negatively were transition to be extended. And that's something else I think that number 10 is trying to take into account in making this decision.
I just have a follow-up just for you, Anand. I was wondering, do you think the transition period should have been extended from other economic and other perspectives? How hard it's going to be to negotiate this in a short amount of time?
I think there are two issues around transition. Firstly is the time to negotiate. And I do think that actually in the time that's left, it'll be hard to negotiate something that is broad and comprehensive simply because of time. So I think we'll end up with something relatively narrow, partly because of time. The second thing is whether or not you should extend transition to allow businesses to adapt. So irrespective of a deal, even if you don't think there will be a deal, some people are saying we could do with extra time because businesses are so swamped with dealing with COVID that they rather deal with the impact of Brexit in a year or 2 years rather than doing it in December. I suppose the counter argument to that is if businesses are busy adapting to the impact of COVID on their supply chains already, it makes sense for them to react to the impact of Brexit on those same supply chains at the same time, rather than doing two different adaptations spaced a couple of years apart. So, you know, you can argue it either way, I think, but many, like the Confederation of British Industry is quite open in saying we need to have a delay because businesses have got too much on their plate now to think about Brexit. So why not give us an extra year to prepare?
Thank you. We have another question, and this is, I'm very happy this came in because this is also my question that I really, really would like answered from, especially Anand. We'll stay with you, and then I'll pass it to Matej. We're running almost out of time, but this is very important. So what are the geopolitical consequences of the UK leaving the EU?
God. Well, I think in a sense, if we don't find a way of collaborating effectively, it weakens both sides. And I think ultimately the big geopolitical movements of our time are happening in terms of different perceptions, you know, changing perceptions of China in the West, a decrease in the reliability of the United States as our leading ally. So we're in a time of profound international change where actually everything, as far as I can see, presses towards the need for the UK and the EU to work closely together. So I think it undermines our ability to react to massive changes happening elsewhere if we can't work together effectively, is how I would answer that.
Thank you. Matej?
Well, there's nothing to add. I fully agree. So in that respect, also take into account the democratic nature of the decision behind it, I think that that might be the most far-ranging, might also say negative consequences of Brexit. I hope I'm wrong. And what's certainly necessary is this tariff cooperation, because the world is changing. The West is somehow in decline, because a little bit it's its own fault, but simply the economy, globalization has pushed the resources elsewhere. So there are interesting and exciting times ahead.
Yeah, hopefully. But I was, the part that concerns me, and is what Anand mentioned earlier at the very opening of his talk here today, that what if the split between the EU and UK is acrimonious? You see, and then if really this negative kind of tit for tat does happen between the UK and EU for the next couple of years, then how does geopolitics is definitely going to play into that. There are going to be actors out there that are going to try to influence or widen that split. How do we prevent that from happening? I know it's a handful, but I'm gonna throw it out there.
I'll get that one. I mean, I think there's no reason for that to happen. Of course, we want to reach a deal, and we're all going to do our best, especially in this period of intensive negotiations coming up. But whether we do or don't, and hopefully we will, then obviously it still makes sense for us to be able to work together well, because we share so many interests and values, and face similar threats also. So I think that would just not be in anyone's interest, and there's absolutely no reason why it should turn out that way. That's certainly not going to be the way we want to operate.
Anand, do you have anything to add to that point?
I think what the ambassador said was absolutely right from the perspective of common sense, but of course, common sense isn't necessarily the thing that drives politics. And my fear about this is if we end up with the talks failing in the autumn, and I'm pretty optimistic actually that we will get a trade deal, albeit quite a thin trade deal. But if we don't, then the temptation on either side to blame the other and ramp up the rhetoric will be there, because you're going to have to find a way of justifying what will be considerable disruption to your populations, and the way to do that is to blame the other side. And if that were to happen, and I sincerely hope it doesn't, it will make cooperation across the board far, far more difficult, I think. And that is very dangerous at this particular moment, given how unstable the world is.
Can I just
My
add
dear
something?
and participants. Okay, Tadej, I will give you last word. You shall have that privilege, but then we really have to wrap it up. I'm on the minute here.
Okay, so thank you. I'd just like to say that we, of course, the geopolitical, it will, if we don't get a firm treaty with the UK, of course, the other players will take the advantage of that. So what my concern is also the second wave of the COVID, which will probably hit, if it hit, end of the year. So it's right before the deal will be concluded. So this is one topic which we need to take a look into it. But we have now a excellent opportunity to negotiate firm treaty to secure close and interlinked future, which will bring stability and prosperity to Europe and to make us strong. So I think it's on all of us, on politicians as well as negotiators to strike the deal. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So let's end on this positive note. We are 1 minute over time, but we're still doing great. Thank you so much for joining us, especially to our panelists for being here. We've done a great amount of topics in 1 hour, and thank you for the participants for the wonderful questions, and we'll see you all soon. After we conclude here, we will still be taking questions online if you'd like to get some answers, and thank you for that.